Welcome to Roundtail Radio. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, look for moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we talk about. We talk about faith. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning, Leslie.
We're a little punchy today.
We are. We're a little slow off the mark, but we're here.
It's all good. I feel like that's kind of what's in the air right now. The choir yesterday, we were all we were doing our best.
All right.
We'll put it that way. Like as a collective whole, there was one moment. So this is a real callback, but we do at the New Year's, we do these star words, which are super fun. We pick them out of a thing.
Yes.
And 2 years ago, our bass soloist, Scott, got patience.
Oh,
and he
love it.
kept his card, and he still has. He has his thing.
Oh, that's great.
And at one point in choir rehearsal yesterday, he reached in. I didn't see him do it. I look over him, and he's holding it up at me with a look on his face like you might need a little, just a reminder. Patience, Leslie. Patience. It was epic.
The words live on.
It was great.
Oh, that's perfect.
Like, yes, I did need an extra, but and also patience with myself
Yes.
too. So it was all good.
All directions.
It was very funny. We have a lot of fun in that group. It's we don't take it ourselves, any of us, too seriously, which I appreciate.
Good orientation.
Oh yeah, for sure. So it is, goodness gracious, almost Holy Week.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Holy Week being the time that starts on Palm Sunday and ends on Easter, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
I was having a conversation yesterday with my mother-in-law that the Greek Orthodox Church, their Easter is May 5th.
A little later
this year.
I know. I have a friend who's out of that Orthodox tradition, and we were talking about Easter, and she said, "Not my Easter.
Not my
said,
Easter.
I've got a ways to wait."
Oh, quite a ways to wait, because usually it's like a week or two later. And the past 2 years, it's just been like the next week.
Yes, and I don't know the intricacies of why that all is, but
it's somewhere in my brain, and I cannot access it this morning. We'll find out. Report back if you guys care.
Yes.
It's very interesting, but it's always so funny because I get to celebrate Easter twice in my family, which is fun.
Good.
But back to Holy Week.
Holy Week.
We were discussing setting the stage for Holy Week because I think it's easy, in that way. I think when we discuss Christmas and Advent, it's easy to kind of go right to the manger, to go right to the birth.
Yes.
When there's scene setting to be done.
Mm-hmm.
So at Holy Week, a lot happens.
Mm-hmm.
First question, was it actually a week?
I think that time and Holy Week that's a whole question unto itself.
A whole thing?
Yeah. And I was mentioning to you earlier that there are two wonderful authors. One of them is still very much active teaching. One of them has since died, since they've done most of their collaborative work, but Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan were wonderful, wonderful scholars. John Dominic Crossan is still active and teaching and writing. But when they would approach something like Holy Week, they would say, we're coming on a way in which the early Christian church sort of understood time in many different ways. And so they were maybe taking events that took a longer period of time and collapsing them into a week. It's hard to know. And they don't all necessarily line up, the different versions exactly.
Sure.
So you have multiple versions of what happened, towards the end of Jesus' life. So I think just the way the time is shaped becomes interesting. But they all move towards this Good Friday, what we now call Holy Saturday, and then the celebration of Easter. But it's a way in which the church told a story, shaped a narrative to give the greatest sense of meaning and purpose to to people who were just beginning to join the movement. So I think it's an open question.
Okay. So from that story, we start off on Palm Sunday. And so what happens on Palm Sunday?
I think that, it's important for us to remember that the whole setting for that event is Passover. So It's Passover in Jerusalem. Jesus is going to take his disciples there. They're going to share a meal there. They're going to gather. And it seems that for a person who was pretty improvisational most of his life, he suddenly becomes very organized.
Okay.
And he has a place prepared where they're going to eat. even the availability of the animals that he will use to
Mm.
ride into Jerusalem,
Mhm.
even that seems to be prepared ahead of time. Because when he sends a few disciples out and tells them you're going to go to a person, you're going to wink and they're going to nod, and there's going to be a certain exchange of
Yeah.
we're all understanding what we're doing here, right?
Right, right, right.
And then you're going to bring the animals back to me, and I'm going to ride them. Um, that's planned ahead.
Okay.
Which I think is fascinating in and of itself because it reveals a different kind of Jesus.
Mhm.
And the fact that he understands that that Passover, his ministry by this time is what, maybe 3 years old? I mean,
Mm.
that's about we think that's the length of his public ministry,
Wow.
3 ± years. So he has, for maybe many different reasons, decided that it's time to have a kind of showdown.
Okay.
And he understands, as would any person living in Jerusalem at this time, that with the Passover and so many people flooding into the city, it's chaotic.
Mm.
And there's always the chance that you're going to have some rabble rousers.
Mhm.
So, what do you do if you're the Roman occupier and you think that there's going to be rabble rousers? You bring in the anti rabble rousing contingent, right?
Right.
And so you've got the governor of the area, that's Pontius Pilate. He's a Roman, he's been appointed to govern this particular area, to oversee it. And so picture that you've got all these people coming into Jerusalem,
Mhm.
way too many people than probably the city can reasonably maintain. And then you've got Pontius Pilate and a contingent of Roman soldiers. And in they come, right? Pontius Pilate, most likely riding out at the head of
Mhm.
this regiment, and he's riding a war horse. They're carrying banners. I
Mhm.
mean, in some ways, it would have been, the height of militaristic exhibitionism.
Yeah, I'm picturing horns and drums
Oh,
and
yes.
hooves.
Tramping of warriors, the
Yeah.
spears striking the ground,
Mhm.
and people lined up, in fear,
Sure.
in hatred, maybe
Mhm.
even a little awe because of all of this, the sight of this procession.
Mm.
But then you've got another procession, though,
Mm.
and that's Jesus and his disciples who decide they're going to come in from a different direction, and he's riding a donkey.
Mm.
And that is also a symbol of a I almost want to say royal figure, because it points back to an Old Testament prophecy about a king coming into a city riding on
Ah,
a donkey because he's humble.
right.
So you have the humble leader coming into the city, conflicting with the warrior
Mhm.
coming into the city.
Mhm.
Just drastic differences between the two processions.
Right.
And when I first heard Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan talk about that, and then I read the book they wrote about that called The Last Week, I was so struck by that conflict of processions.
Mhm.
Just the very different values being embodied in each.
I'm imagining the crowds reacting very differently to
Mm.
Jesus. I'm in my mind's eye, I'm also hearing children
Hmm.
laughing or, making happy sounds,
Yeah.
that it's a much more altogether, like, relaxed, joyful, like, there's not the tension, there
Y-
isn't the
r-
s
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that the stories that have come down to us now, some of them, we make a big deal about the palms, but I think the palms are
Right.
only in one story.
Oh, yeah.
And so everything you're describing in terms of the children's response makes sense, right? They're
Right.
throwing the palms around, or
Yeah.
whatever it is that they're tossing.
Yeah,
Some
yeah.
some story says that they're throwing some of their outer cloaks, their garments. It's kind of
Mm.
like the red carpet treatment.
Right, right.
Um, but it's definitely, there's a sense of exuberance about that, and you can understand. It also makes sense. It says that the Pharisees, who are part of the Jewish religious community, that they tell the disciples to cool it. We don't want this.
Right.
Like, simmer down,
Uh-huh.
because if you've got Pontius Pilate
Right.
and
You don't want
soldiers
any
come in,
trouble,
right?
right? Yeah.
Let's just calm things down. And Jesus then makes what's become one of his maybe most memorable statements, where he said, if you silence these,
Mm.
even the stones will cry out.
Mm.
So it's as if the creation itself is going to celebrate this event, even if you silence the disciples. You
Right,
can't do it, right?
right.
because it's such an important, momentous thing. So that is really that's the setup for Holy Week, right? That's the setup for what's going to happen.
Right. So it's sort of all these forces coming to a head, the aggressor, the occupiers, and
Yep.
the humble uh, you know, peacemakers, I guess. I don't know.
Certainly embodying peace,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And I think that, we've been talking a lot about values over the last 6 or 7 months.
Mm,
And here's a wonderful example of where Jesus actually does, humility is on full display,
right.
right? If it was always there as a thread throughout his entire adult lifetime and before,
Mm,
there's no mistaking it now,
right.
right? Because he's chosen on his manner of transport, right?
Right.
To say, this is the kind of ruler, this is the kind of leader that
Yeah.
I am.
He knew he was making a statement, and
Mm.
sounds like humility was the statement he was wanting to make
Hmm.
and have it be the lasting sort of image.
Yeah.
So they went to Jerusalem for Passover. That's why they were there,
Hmm.
to celebrate with each other, or why Jerusalem? Do we know?
Well, I mean, they're going to the capital city. They're there because this is where everybody else is. It's a pilgrimage site.
Mm,
Everybody's flooding in the same direction. But Jesus anticipates the way the story unfolds. It seems that he anticipates that that his last supper
okay.
is going to take place. Being in conflict is going to lead to a backlash.
Right. Do we know, is there a tie-in with Passover? Now, am I correctly remembering that Passover was from Moses' times?
So
This is very
Passover is a
tenuous knowledge for me.
remembrance of the liberation of Jews from
Yeah.
Egypt. Yes. So the tie-in is that the Passover meal is a memory of liberty, right? It's
Mhm.
a memory of freedom, of being liberated from bondage. And I do think there's a tie-in. The liberation here is that it's coming not so much through force
Mhm.
as through the quality of the community and the constant introduction and reintroduction of love into the world.
Mm.
That it's really that, Jesus, as one author put it, Jesus means freedom.
Mhm.
So wherever he is, people are opening up to a new way of doing things, not based on domination,
Right.
aggression, being overbearing. It's really about honoring and respecting and liberating others.
Mhm.
So there is an interesting connection there.
Mhm.
Yep.
And so, we're not thinking too literally about Holy Week in terms of like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday,
Right.
Friday.
Yep.
For the sort of modern Western Christian church, the next big day we honor is Maundy Thursday. Is there one
Hmm.
before that that we tend to skip as a modern church, or that just sort of is the next one?
Yeah, I think that what happens is that during that interlude between, let's say, entrance and then what we imagine taking place and what we
Mhm,
call, Maundy Thursday, which
mhm.
is the Last Supper, that's when all kinds of events happen. And if you read one gospel account next to another, you'll see that they all imagine slightly different things happening. There's
Okay.
overlap,
Yeah.
significant overlap. But it is interesting that in the Gospel of John, the entrance into Jerusalem actually takes place way back at the beginning of the gospel, or there's a story of it happening
Oh, yeah?
earlier on. The others all place it very much towards the end. And
Mhm.
John has his own vision of what happens towards the conclusion of Jesus' ministry. But yeah, there's a lot of teaching that happens during those days, a lot of interaction with the people who are there in Jerusalem. It's fascinating to see how they all see it a little differently.
Yeah. So he's sort of meeting with people.
Hmm.
Is he doing any healing? Are there any miracles, or it's a little bit more, it's teaching, it's parables?
I feel like that most of the emphasis is on him as a teacher, and there are definitely parables included in that, and there's a kind of a I think there's almost a kind of a harshness
Mhm.
about some of those stories, in terms of the lessons that are communicated. But what is it that you say when you think your time to say what you want to
Mm.
is starting to narrow
Yeah,
down?
you get a little bit
All
more
right.
to the point.
Right. And so there's a whole variety of messages that get communicated at that time.
Okay. So Passover arrives, and he sits down with his buddies,
Yep. His
if you will, his
disciples.
inner
Yep.
circle.
Hmm.
bumbling, wonderful
Mhm.
guys that
As
they
they
are.
are. Yep.
Just love how we picture them on this podcast. It makes me
Quite a mixture.
smile. They just feel so fully human,
Yeah.
and I find an entry point in that for my humanity, I think.
Don't we all?
I like their flaws. I'm very fond of them. They make me feel better.
He stays with them, right? I mean, it's not until the very, very end where you have the figure of Judas,
Mhm.
that casts a very long shadow over the supper.
Sure.
But they're all there. In some ways, um, they all flee in their own way. They all back out of the story in their own way, but
Mhm.
then with a notable exception, they all reappear,
Yeah. Yeah.
stay part of it.
Yeah. So then we're choosing here to honor Maundy Thursday in a kind of a, I would say, different way. It's different than I've experienced before, but I'm
Hmm.
also excited because I feel like there's something really just deeply authentic in what we're going to do. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the friend of mine who was a seminary professor, wonderful scholar, his name is Hal Tausig. He wrote a book called "In the Beginning Was the Meal."
Oh, nice.
Isn't that a great
Our
title?
people would like that.
Right. I love that title.
Feed them, they will come.
And when he wrote that book, I had a chance to visit the seminary where he teaches, Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And so I went there as a student. He actually started there after I left. So I met him some years later. But there is a chapel service every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so I went, and it happened to be a communion service.
Oh, interesting.
And so I thought, oh, I'd love to do that. I hadn't been there in a long, long time. And when I
Mhm.
went in, it was arranged so that there were huge round tables,
Mm.
and people were all seated around these tables. So normally when you think about communion, you've got all of the elements arrayed on the
Yes.
communion table, and there's a beautiful, container for the wine, and there's bread. That
Mhm.
was not the case.
Mhm.
These were tables, and at every table there was food. There was bagels and croissants and, orange juice and coffee. And I thought, this is great. First of all,
Now we're talking.
now we're talking. In the beginning was the meal.
Yeah.
Okay. And his point is so obvious that in the beginning was the meal,
Mm.
right? We have, of course, taken that meal and condensed it into a ritual,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's kind of like your question about, so how long was Holy Week,
Yeah.
right? So the way that a lot of times authors will view time is they'll condense things,
Sure.
right? And say it took 3 days or it took 2
Right.
days. We know that it probably took 2 weeks, or
Yeah.
whatever the event is we're talking about.
Mm.
So here was at Union, here was this amazing array of fellowship, people talking around the table, food, eating. And so as I sat down, people passed me something, and then Hal came forward and he said, what we're trying to do here is to reclaim the sense of communion as an actual meal.
Mm.
And then he proceeded to talk about that at great length.
Yeah.
And one of his comments about that is that he thinks that in the early Christian church, as it was evolving, meals became an opportunity for people to practice equality.
Say more.
Right?
I'm excited about this.
I love that. And so if you think about Rome as being, in some ways, it was a highly stratified world.
Sure.
But basically, it was super, super, rich or affluent by today's standards, and then a tremendous number of very impoverished people.
Okay.
But even within there were gradations, right?
Mhm.
So it was expected that certain people would sit in certain places when they ate.
Sure.
Other people are serving. Other people
Mhm.
are, reclining on couches, which
Mm.
is how they often ate. So in the early Christian church, they decide to kind of flatten that out.
Mm.
What may have been quite a hierarchical experience of a meal now
Uh,
becomes kind of like Sunday supper.
Kind of I'm picturing, like, Knights of the Round Table kind of a thing where
Right?
there's no head and it's
Right.
intentionally set up that way.
And so it's clear that this was important to him because he mentions in one of his letters that one of the churches in Corinth in Greece
Mm.
was not doing that. There's
Tisk
always
tisk.
somebody.
There's always somebody.
You know?
Send a mean letter again.
And he had to dress him down and say, that is not what I'm talking about, people. And I mean, like they were actually apparently reserving some of the better food for
Oh,
one group.
oh,
Yeah.
geez. Oh, geez.
And there's like an adult version of the children's table that's out in the, I don't know, entryway
Oh my
somewhere. Yeah,
gosh.
it was not good. And so he had to call their attention to that. And that's in
Mm.
the first letter of Corinthians,
Yeah.
because it was moving exactly against this intention,
Yeah.
right? Of let's make this an equal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you read through his letters, you see all of these references to women as leaders,
Now we're talking.
right?
Yeah.
And here is all of that material that's embedded in his letters.
Right.
Clearly, he's depending on women in various, from various backgrounds
Right.
to play leadership roles in the church.
Why not?
Why not?
Why not?
So, because if everybody's coming in to eat together,
Right.
and there's a sense that everybody here is a Christ person, and this is the body of Christ,
Mm-hmm.
we cannot have one part,
Yeah.
emphasized rather than the other. And he does say that, one part of the body cannot say to the other, I'm more important than you. Everybody is needed.
Yeah.
So in some ways, the meal that Jesus has, with his disciples, it would have been, of course, this Passover meal. There would have been remembrances.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows exactly what that looked like? But it also is this very precious time where he makes it clear that this is indeed the last time he's ever going to eat with them,
Mm-hmm.
at least on this side of the grave.
Mm.
And so, and he continues to make the meal available to everyone there, even though he has a sense that some of them are going to cause him a lot of trouble. But soon thereafter, you get the sense that one of the big reasons the church communicated itself to the world was because of the way that it ate.
Right.
It actually used meals in a little way that it's sort of like Jesus used the donkey. Here's a way to communicate what the world looks like when you elevate humility. Here's the way the world looks like when everybody gets a seat at the table.
Which is a big statement.
Huge.
And I
huge,
think
very
that's
countercultural.
I love that. And I think it's really interesting. And of course, I mean no disrespect to the tradition of communion as celebrated in churches throughout the world. And I think it's a very powerful experience. But I also think this idea of a real meal together is super powerful because that community, I find, take receiving communion, especially in a parish that honors transubstantiation, it's very like personal and very individual. Sometimes I always feel a little put on the spot in a way because there's like priest, especially if you're like kneeling at a rail, there's like a priest like standing above you, and you're like, this is just. I feel a little deeply. I personally feel uncomfortable in that situation, but I feel like I need to like do the thing. And so I find something. I'm excited to experience this idea of it being a meal and finding something holy within the community aspect of it, the sharing aspect of it, the equality aspect of it. I think it's a really interesting way to think about that day, and especially because I feel like in sort of air quote the real world, Maundy Thursday kind of gets it's the lesser noted. In the South, like people get school off on Good Friday.
Yes. Yes.
The movie mentions Maundy Thursday.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that we're not really sure what to do with it.
Yeah.
It's there's also another way of celebrating Maundy Thursday, which has been to use what's called the service of tenebrae, or the service of shadows, so that in sanctuaries, and it's very moving. It also includes the sacrament of Holy Communion. But as there are a series of readings, and after each reading, the lights are dimmed, right? Just that little bit extra, until the sanctuary may be in complete darkness with the exception of a single candle. And that candle is brought out of the sanctuary. Often there is the sound of 34 hammer blows against a cross or whatever there might be in the church. And then the lit candle is returned to the altar. And that's a very powerful experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we're trying to do this year, though, is to actually focus on the meal itself
Mm-hmm.
as a meal.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to eat together. And it will give us a chance to create a meal as a time of exploration, asking questions, as we've been doing. What is humility?
Yeah.
What happened during Holy Week? Did it collapse? Was time collapsed, or what exactly? And how do all these gospel writers view it differently? Why did some use it to tell stories? Why did some use it in another way?
Yeah.
There's so much variety
Mm.
and richness there.
Yeah.
And I do think that when you're gathered with folks around a table, you can just talk about all of that.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not only the focus on the way it's always been.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we love questions here, don't we?
We do love questions.
We do love questions.
We're questionologists.
We are. Absolutely. And I would say, too, as we go into Holy Week, we would love to hear your questions. What questions
Please.
what questions did I not think to ask, which I'm sure there's a million? And then also, what questions do you have about maybe Good Friday or Holy Saturday or Easter that we love a good old fashioned Ask Ed.
Stump Ed.
Stump Ed.
Yeah.
It's tough. Do your worst, friends. But what questions do you guys have? You can leave them in the video comment if you're watching on YouTube. You can also visit roundhillradio.org. And there's a form, right? It's literally the first thing you see on the website. So we would love to hear from you guys and hear what questions you have, what insight you have into your own experience. What are you guys doing for Holy Week this year? Do you have a favorite experience you've had before? We would love to hear from you. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Ed, for this conversation.
Thank you.
Round Hill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Round Hill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillradio.org.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are a few things that you can do that would make a big difference to us. Like the video, subscribe if you aren't, and click the notification bell and select all. Thank you.